I want to ask Gayle a question right now because I read an article you'd written. You're talking about kind of how people perceive the relationship of artists and recordings, and you wrote about Folkways and really how Ella was supporting them in the long run. And I'd just love to hear a little more about that.
When Ella approached Mo Ash with her idea for her first album, she met with someone who was very interested in children's music and cultivating an educational market, which didn't really exist in the 50s and early 60s. So it was kind of a really fortuitous meeting of the minds where Mo Ash understood the value and genius of Ella's music. And he also saw a way that her music could serve his interests in putting out what he saw as a kind of alternative to commercial children's music, which he and other folkies and people on the left had various critiques of commercial children's music. And so she could serve his interests in developing a market for non-commercial children's music and, in fact, creating an educational market. And so over the years, Ella was incredibly prolific. And anytime she had an idea, she never planned things in advance, but she would let herself be inspired. And of course, because she was so curious about the world, she was constantly being inspired. And children are also inspiring. And so every time she would go to Mo and say, I have an idea for this, or I see a need for this, or teachers say they really want more of this, he would let her do it. In 1966, she put out an album called You'll Sing a Song and I'll Sing a Song, which sold very well for Folkways. She's putting out albums beginning in 1957, but by the mid-60s, she's really earning money for Folkways. So the story that many people in Folkways will tell, or Smithsonian Folkways will tell of Ella, is that sales of Ella's catalog, especially once she became synonymous with music and early childhood education in the later part of the 60s, and really got taken up broadly by educators, music teachers, recreation professionals, and people who just bought her records, that she sustained Folkways, especially after the heyday of the folk revival in the 70s, when, Folkways could no longer rely on college students who were interested in buying Pete Seeger records or Woody Guthrie records. They needed another source of income. So it is the case that Ella kept that label afloat and allowed Mo Ash, and who really didn't seem to care very much about whether his records had any commercial audience.
That's
it
wonderful.
allowed him, he was like almost antagonistic to commercial success. It allowed him to go pursue his niche projects, recording frogs or things like that weren't going to sell a lot, but were sonically really interesting. So it allowed him to continue to do that. So in Ella's life story, there's also a story of a Black woman sustaining not just a label, but Folkways is kind of, I think of it like it's a label, but also a kind of broader cultural enterprise, really associated with the folk revival and with a certain American project of like capturing America's sonic heritage. Folkways is right at the center of that. And here you have a Black woman making music primarily, but not exclusively targeted at young people, young listeners, who's really the backbone of it. So to me, there is a story about a Black woman behind this record label that's associated, I think most popularly with Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and maybe also Leadbelly. I find that really interesting and poignant. And I do think that this is not at this point an untold story. For a while, I think it was an untold story, but Smithsonian acquired Folkways around 1987 after Mo Ash's death. The heads of that new record label, Smithsonian Folkways, were very aware that Ella had kept the label afloat. And so you'll see that when Smithsonian Folkways became its own entity, some of the first CD reissues they did were of Ella's music. So they had this catalog that mostly wasn't on CD, so they were reissuing material from the Folkways catalog on Smithsonian Folkways.
Right. You see that when you go and search for her music, you just see that they continue to release her music. And so that it's wonderful that it stays alive that way.
Mm-hmm.
You'll Sing a Song and I'll Sing a Song. This is Ella Jenkins' signature song. As Gayle mentioned earlier, this song with others sustained Folkway Records and Smithsonian Folkways. If you think larger, it's also part of oral tradition. It was passed through families, and also as teachers would bring the song into the classroom.